When Ramana Maharshi was alive, one of the persistent inquiries at his satsangs was about suffering and the nature of suffering itself. Let me explain to you Ramana Maharshi's final truth on the nature of suffering. Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva. When the great 20th century sage and Advaita master Ramana Maharshi was alive, he encountered many devotees who were often concerned about suffering and the nature of suffering. And this is a common question, obviously. We find this within all of the great Eastern traditions. Doesn't matter whether it's the many schools of Hinduism or Buddhism or even Taoism. Suffering is a point of focus for all traditions. And I feel like no one explains this better than Ramana himself. And there is a particular dialogue between a devotee and himself, which actually pulls the rug from underneath us when we look at the nature of suffering. And you'll need to understand some concepts around Advaita Vedanta to understand this dialogue, which I'll explain. But this is a question and answer from a devotee to Ramana Maharshi. Why should there be suffering? Who suffers? What is suffering? If you are new to Eastern philosophical and spiritual thought, you would think, what the hell is going on here, right? Who suffers? What is suffering? Everyone thinks that they know what this is, right? And even if people look at Buddhism, they think that Buddhism is about suffering. Buddha said life is suffering and so forth and so on, even though he created the Noble Eightfold Path, which is to transcend suffering itself and to realize that suffering doesn't actually exist. And this is what Ramana is pointing us to as well. Because in the question, the devotee says, why should there be suffering? So implying that suffering exists. Now you're talking to an enlightened sage, right? And for an enlightened sage, suffering does not exist. Ramana Maharshi from the age of 16 is believed to have attained moksha from that age and to be in this permanent abidance in the Atman, right? The undifferentiated consciousness, which is identical with the ultimate reality of Brahman, is the ultimate reality of Brahman, basically. And so Ramana was in this state until the day he died in that bodily form. And so from that perspective, who suffers from Ramana's perspective, right? When someone asks him who suffers, you have to think about then the nature of the I. Who is the I, right? Not who am I, as a lot of people associate with Ramana. It's more so what am I, right? Who implies a person. What am I? And so when we look at ourselves and we think about ourselves as a persona or an ego, we need to think about the concept of Jiva, right? Jiva is a construct. It's a persona, system, and ego. So it's everything you've accumulated throughout your life. It's the accumulative self, right? And so you've become this person, in air quotes, with a name, a form, a job title, a nationality. You think you're this particular gender and this particular race and so forth and so on. But from the ultimate state, none of that exists, right? This is all just part of the Saguna Brahman level. Saguna Brahman here is Brahman with qualities, where Ramana abides on the Niguna Brahman level, which is Brahman without qualities. And this is exactly the same as what Chi is in Taoism, right? It's Tao in stillness, Tao in nothingness, so to speak. And we can't understand what that is with a logical mindset, but an enlightened sage abides in that. They reside in that undifferentiated consciousness, which a lot of us only touch very briefly, but the enlightened sage abides in it permanently. And so from Ramana's perspective, who could suffer, right? It's only the jiva, the conditioning, pressing up against other jivas and the world itself that suffers. But the jiva itself is built on Maya. Now, Maya is often translated as illusion, but the correct translation is the illusion of measurement. So from a subjective perspective, the jiva gets conditioned, right? So we dissect the world up into this and that according to our conditioning, according to our likes and our dislikes. And so we fragment the oneness of the world into duality, right? So we fragment non-duality into duality itself. And then when things don't go according to our jiva, then we suffer, right? When the duality that we have playing out in our mind doesn't go according to plan, then we suffer. But we need to remember that we're out there and we're pressing up against other people's jivas who are dissecting the world up into this and that, and we're creating karmic stock for ourselves, which we will have to resolve either in this life or the next. And even saying this life or the next, from Ramana Maharshi's perspective, there is no next life because there is only the here and now. But when you believe you're a jiva, the jiva then is entangled with the Atman, right? And so that's what comes back life after life. You haven't combed out the jiva. You haven't combed out the conditioning out of your consciousness. You need to comb that out. You need to get that out of your consciousness and come back to that undifferentiated state. Then you can just live your life gracefully without the need of pushing your agenda on others or the need of suffering and so forth and so on, because there is no you. There is no I. The I is evaporated, right? And so who could suffer if there is no I? But that's all well and good for Ramana Maharshi to say, but we all know that we suffer from the level of the jiva. But the point Ramana is making is that the jiva doesn't exist. You've bought into this illusion that it exists, and it's only the illusion of Maya. Jiva is the byproduct of Maya, of the conditioning, of the measurement of reality according to our conditioning. And once we realize that game, then we start to peel the layers back, and that's when we start to feel a resonance with that undifferentiated consciousness. And then the idea of I, of you, of the persona, of the ego becomes very vague, and it starts to vanish. And this is what happens to all people on the spiritual path if they're earnest and they're sincere. And so from Ramana Maharshi's perspective, who suffers? There is no I. And so if there is no I, what is suffering itself? Suffering doesn't exist from the enlightened sage's perspective. It's only a phenomenon related to the jiva. Suffering is a phenomenon related to the jiva. The phenomenon of the undifferentiated consciousness is ananda, is unassociated bliss. Bliss and joy emanate from a sage because they've dissociated with the jiva. They've completely dissociated with the jiva. They've put a gap between them and the jiva and watched the jiva just begin to disappear because the jiva doesn't really exist. You just believe in this temporary hypnosis of who you are, and then you experience the phenomenon of suffering. And so from Ramana Maharshi's perspective, what is suffering? It doesn't exist. It's like asking someone, what is a baba baba? Baba baba, I just made that word up. It doesn't exist, right? And so that's what Ramana hears. When he hears suffering, he just hears baba baba. He hears something that is completely illogical and is a phenomena of the jiva, not of the Atman. And the Atman is Brahman, and that is the ultimate reality. And so you have to think about what Shankara said, one of the great verses, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. Now what Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya means is the world is an appearance. Brahman alone is real. And so that means the jiva is an appearance on the screen of consciousness. It's completely unreal. And so the universe is only real when we understand it as Brahman alone. When we think of the universe as this dualistic world, it is Maya, it is an illusion. But when we understand that the universe is Brahman, then we know that oneness is the ultimate reality. And so, a good representation of this is the snake and the rope, right? Where people will take the rope to be a snake and they'll act accordingly, right? They'll suffer accordingly because they think that the rope is a snake. But the rope has always been Atman. But you thought that it was the snake of Jiva. And so you look out at the world, you superimpose your conditioning on the world, your likes and your dislikes, and you react in turn, right? You have fear, you are happy some moments, you suffer other moments. It's a roller coaster of life. But the snake is really the rope. And that's what Shankara was trying to say. And that's what Ramana Maharshi is saying to this devotee. The snake is the rope. Stop believing in this snake. It's a hypnosis. You misperceive reality. You're not seeing reality as it truly is because you are operating from a hypnotic state. And so that's what Ramana is saying in this quote. We fundamentally are Atman, which is Brahman, and the Jiva itself is just an illusion, and suffering is just a phenomenon of this illusion. Suffering itself does not even exist from the undifferentiated state of Atman, which is the ultimate reality of Brahman. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.
Aruna